Okay, g'day folks, it's me back again, and what I'm going to do is produce a series of videos on the comparative adaptive morphology of scorpions. At this stage I don't know how many I'll do. It'll probably be 3 or 4, and when I make these videos I pretty much ad-lib them, so apologies in advance for any mistakes I make. If I don't make it as clear as I could have, I'll try my best. So comparative adaptive morphology, this first one's going to be on the scorpion's tail. Let's get the slide to change. So we might ask ourselves, well, what is comparative adaptive morphology and why would we study it? Well, comparative means comparing, and adaptive morphology is looking at animals that are closely related. In this case, we'll be looking at different species of scorpions, and then looking at a particular feature of the animal, a particular morphology of the animal, and seeing how that morphology varies within a species, so intraspecifically, as well as between species or interspecifically. And then see if I can see a pattern, see if we can recognize some sort of patterns. And the idea of this really is maybe to help people think about what might be happening. So when they see an animal like a scorpion, if they're studying scorpions or they're studying beetles or spiders or whatever they're studying, it's a good idea to look at similar species and just see what's changing. Have a look at how the morphology changes, and then see if you can relate that back to the environment and the way the animal lives. Because I believe that most of the characters in an animal are under selective pressure. Now, some characters are going to have more of an influence on the animal's evolution than others. Some characters not so great, but they get carried along because they're just part of the way things are. They might be a bit neutral, so they might not have a lot of selective pressure on them. They might have a little bit, and they get carried along. Other characters might be very, very strongly selected for. So a character can either be selected for, so in other words, a change to a character might be selected for, it might be selected against, or it might have no effect. It might be a sort of a neutral character change. So in this case here, this is Urodacus shevchenko. It's a juvenile from out near Roxby Downs in South Australia. And we have the tail, what we call the tail. We have the body of the scorpion in the middle here. We have the pedipalps, the front of it is the cephalothorax, and then we have the legs. So I'll probably do a video, I will do a video on the legs, because the legs are quite variable in scorpions. As I said, this one's on the tail. The mesosoma, the body, I probably won't do anything as a separate video on that. And the pedipalps, I might do a separate video on those, because there are some things to say about those. And I might do a video that just covers a few different unrelated aspects that vary between scorpions. So I'm trying not to make it too long, but I do want to go into a bit of detail with what's going on. I mean, even immediately in this picture here, I mean, have a look at these front legs. Look how you've got these large numbers of hairs on the front leg here, and there's a leg hiding under here, and there it is here. But these hairs don't exist on these legs, not to this extent. They're actually quite different. And also the terminal claws vary. Well, that's adaptive morphology. So I'm looking at how these different kinds of little things can change between species and within species. So just to get the understanding down of the body parts, we've got the word soma, and soma means body. And we divide the scorpion up into the head end, or the prosoma, which comes first, so the cephalothorax, and it's covered by this carapace, or this sort of dorsal shield. We then have the mid-body, which is called the mesosoma, which contains all the gut and reproductive organs. And then we also have the metasoma. So metasoma, which means after, it came after, it's what we call the tail. It's actually soma, in fact it's part of the body. It has the alimentary canal running through it, and the anus, where it poops, is located right up here, where I'm showing you here. So from an anatomical perspective, the stinger is actually the tail, but we refer to this whole section as the tail. And this segment here of the mesosoma is actually has more in common with these tail segments than it does with the body segments. But we don't include that as part of the tail. We include all of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 segments, and the aculeus, the telson. This is the aculeus, this is the vesicle of the telson, which is the stinging apparatus. Okay. All right, so looking at the tail consists of 5 segments. You can't see them all here. This is segment 2, this is segment 3, segment 4, this is segment 5, and then we have the telson. So collectively, the stinger is called the telson. It's comprised of the vesicle, which is the venom bulb, you might call it. It contains venom, and it has the muscles and things for the venom control. It has the stinger, which is the aculeus, and as I said, the anus is located here. One of the things which I like to look at on scorpion tails, and one of the things that varies a lot and is great for adaptive morphology, comparative studies, are these things called the keels, the carinae or keels. So carinae is plural, so these are carinae. One of them would be called a carina, without the E on the end. And we're going to look at these keels, we're going to look at how they vary, and maybe have a think about what they might be used for and what kind of selective pressures might exist on them. Alright, so the tail. The scorpion's tail. Why do we look at a scorpion's tail? What is a scorpion's tail used for? Well, if you asked anybody, they would say to sting. So the tail is commonly used in defense, and that's part of how the stinging apparatus has evolved. So defensive, so it can sting a potential predator. The predator is in pain, wards that predator off. Of course, then also it can be used for killing prey, for rendering prey immobile. I mean, for instance, in this case, this is a Urodacus elongatus from Flinders Ranges of South Australia. It's stinging a cricket. It doesn't need to sting the cricket. The scorpion is large and powerful enough to overpower the cricket, but stinging it immobilizes the cricket, probably makes it easier to feed on. And it's also possible that the venom may well act in helping to digest the insides of the prey item. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. So, warding off potential predators. Administering a sting to prey items, kill it, immobilize it. Another thing that scorpions use a tail for, which is not usually thought about, is they use it a lot in digging out burrows and clearing out burrows. If they're living under something, they have to clear an area out. So they often break down dirt with their mouth parts, but they'll also push soil out with their tail. And this tail here you can see sticking out. What the scorpion here is doing is actually pushing the soil out. So the tail is bending like this, and it's pushing the soil away. And this is where these keels that I mentioned, these carinae, become important to understand. So let's look at Urodacus. Urodacus are large scorpions found right across Australia. They're endemic to Australia. And they're all obligate burrowers, so they all have to burrow. Some of them dig a deep burrow. Others live underneath a rock. They'll have a short burrow, and they'll have a scrape area, or sort of a living area underneath the rock. Now, if we look at them, we see a fair degree of variation in the carination or the keels of the tail, these keels. You can see how each keel has got like little teeth running along it. In this case, there's a little spine on the dorsal, on the uppermost, the top dorsal keel has an elongated spine on the end. Now you can imagine, and look at this part here. Now, if this scorpion has to move soil and dig soil and disrupt soil to be able to push the soil out, these keels are going to act a bit like a file, like a harsh file. They're actually going to bite into the soil, loosen the soil up, and then the scorpion can push it out. So my feeling is that these keels have evolved in assisting the scorpion to remove soil, because soil removal is fairly important for a scorpion, because it's really a time factor thing. It's not so much, I wouldn't believe it's so much an energy related factor, although that it also is important. But the more time the scorpion spends at the surface, at the mouth of the burrow, with its tail out trying to remove soil, the more vulnerable it is, the more likely it's going to be taken and killed and eaten. So if you have an efficient means of removing soil, you're going to be spending a lot less time in that process. So I think I think the evolutionary pressure on this tail is on soil removal. So let's have a look at these guys. Now, this is Gerodacus planomanus. So the last one, this is a species that lives in inland South Australia. It's an undescribed species. It digs a burrow. I know very little about it. I've only found a few of them. It has to dig a burrow because it lives in a very, very arid area in places up around Woomera and Roxby Downs. Everything up there digs a burrow. It has to survive. So it appears to be a burrower. This one, Gerodacus planomanus, this is a rock scrape dweller. So these guys live under a rock. They dig a scrape out or a clearing, and they have a burrow. And what's common amongst rock-dwelling Gerodacus is they have these very, very large terminal spines, and on the tail, these large terminal spines here, and they have quite significant, quite rugged keels. That's a very common feature amongst these guys that live underneath rocks. And once again, I tend to think that it's probably got to do with soil removal. These spines are larger in males than females, so there is slight sexual dimorphism. The only thing I can put that down to is that males have to wander and find a female if they have to create a new burrow. In other words, if they don't go back to their own burrow, which they may not do, then being able to produce a burrow more quickly is going to aid in their survival. So possibly enlarged spines might have something to do with that. I don't know. That's speculation on my part. I really don't know what's going on there. That's what I'm leaning towards, given that the hypothesis that that's what the ridges or these keels are for. If that's true, then it might be that. I don't see it as being used as any kind of defense. I don't have any evidence for that. I haven't seen any behavior that suggests to me that these keels have really anything to do with defense. This is another Gerodacus. These guys dig burrows. This is a coastal species. It might be what we call Novae helenidae and Novae helenidae. It digs a burrow, but these guys generally don't live under rocks. And the keels are still very, very pronounced. Very strong spination and very strong keels. Very denticulate up here on the ventral surface of the fifth tail segment. But they are active burrowers, so more than likely these keels once again are burrow adaptive, soil removing adaptive keels. Now, this is Centralis, Gerodacus centralis, once again, fairly large keels, but what's really obvious about this is the elongated tail segments. So this is a sexual dimorphism. Some scorpions have very long tails in the males. Just about all scorpions, especially I think all the scorpions that I've looked at, there is a slight difference between the males and the females. The males always have a longer tail than the females. And the degree of that difference varies between species. And in some species, such as this one, the male has a very, very long tail. This is Urodacus manicatus from the this particular one's from the Mount Lofty Ranges in South Australia. These guys are rock scrape dwellers. Once again, very, very strongly formed carinae and keels. This one is a species of Urodacus which it seems to fit very closely to a species called butleri, which hasn't been around a long time, named after Harry Butler. And once again, it's got very strong keels, but quite smooth, shiny tail segments. So I really don't know what's going on there. It's hard to say, but the interesting thing is that this animal is different. There's variation here with this one. Urodacus hoplurus from Western Australia, you can see the extremely exaggerated spines. I mean, when you look at it, you would think surely this has got something to do with male-male interaction, fighting, or warding off predators or something, but I just don't see any real evidence for that myself. Coffee. So at this point in time, I'm sticking with my digging theory on this one. Now this is the female, so you can see how the tail is shorter. So this is the male, very, very long tail segments, especially the fifth. The fifth is always greatly exaggerated in males. Huge terminal spines on the dorsal keel. Female has a normal fifth tail segment length. Still has the keels, but they're not as prominent. And females live in one burrow their entire life. They just make that burrow large unless they get kicked out or displaced and they have to build a new burrow, which they can do fairly quickly. They don't go anywhere. They're sit and wait predators. So if the digging hypothesis is correct, then it just means that they don't have the same degree of pressure on them to dig a new burrow as a male does. So this is Urodacus shiashenkoi. Now, this is where it gets important, because what tends to happen is these guys here are the most samophilic. Samophile is an animal that lives in sand. These are the most sand-adapted scorpions, Urodacus scorpions, that we have in Australia. And they're found right from the Riverland area in South Australia, Renmark, Berry, right through the centre, going up towards the northwest of Australia. And they're more than likely a species complex. There's more than likely a number of species going across there, depending on how you determine your species. But they occupy this very, very loose sand. Now, this sand is easily moved. It's not difficult to move. I mean, you can dig a hole in it with your own hand. It's very, very easy to dig. And notice that the degree of carination, or these keels on the tail, is very, very greatly reduced. The spines are reduced and the keels are reduced. And this is a male. Another thing I'll mention here is that the stinging bulb on the male is often larger in Urodacus, and that may also be due to the fact that the male has to go out and search for the female, so he's exposing himself to predators. Alright, so, and that's why I think that the keels, I don't think it has anything to do with predators, because here's a perfect example of an animal that has to wander, find a female, but it doesn't have these huge spines. So clearly it doesn't need them. But it does have a larger vesicle. So this might be that it can produce more venom. It might be more powerful in the way that it delivers the venom, because these guys, being males, they are more likely to come across a predator as they wander about looking for a female. Whereas all the female has to do, if a predator comes along, is duck back down the burrow. So greatly reduced keels on this adult male that lives in a very sandy environment. as opposed to some of these other animals. This is a fairly standard environment animal too, but I think it's probably harder soil, more clay-like. This one I'm not so sure about. This one definitely a hard soil. The other thing to remember too is that different species will evolve at different rates depending on the gene pool size. If you have a very, very large gene pool, you're going to get very slow evolution. You end up with, if you get small isolated gene pools, then you can get a very rapid evolution and you can get very rapid changes in these kind of characteristics. This little guy, so this is Yashenkoi, this little guy here lives in the same geographic area as Yashenkoi, as the previous scorpion. It's a lot smaller. These guys are only about 30, 35 millimeters. This one here gets 90. A really big one would be 100, but 90 is a common size for these. These guys maybe 30, 35 millimeters. Now, this scorpion is very unusual in that they have they're very widespread, and there are clearly lots of different variants. They're all sort of under the heading of Urodacus armatus, which is probably bogus to start with. But there'll be lots of different species. The thing about these guys is they simply are not specialists. This species is a specialist, very, very much a specialist. It only lives in one particular soil type, digs one type of burrow, is very, very highly specialized. This guy here, you'll find it in sand environments, you'll find it in clay soils, you'll find it in gritty shell beach type of soils. It's just everywhere. It's not fussy. The keels on it on this particular one, and as a result of that, what I just said about the variation in where they're found results also in variation in these keels. These keels vary quite significantly. In this one, you can see they're very tooth-like. So instead of having one very large, pronounced spine at the end of these dorsal keels, there's just like a row of little tiny teeth, sort of like a file, like a real harsh file. And I've watched these scorpions pushing the soil out. Like their tail goes backwards and forwards, and they can even like push it up against the top of their burrow and break the soil away from the top of the burrow, which might be a lot to do with what these spines are about, rather than just the floor of the burrow, because the scorpion's got to dig away the top as well. So it's certainly got something to do with digging. There's no doubt about that. This is another armatus. This one's from much further south. Similar degree of ridges and keels, similar degree of teeth on them, very, very much the same, not all that different. Okay, so now when I talked about the long tail in Urodacus, this is the reason why. This is a male Urodacus elongatus from the Flinders Ranges of South Australia. This is the female. The female has what you'd call a sort of normal tail, but the male has this greatly exaggerated long tail. And the reason is that he has to, when the male and the female come together to exchange for the male to inseminate the female, what happens is that the male has to sting the female, and in this species he always stings the female in this membrane right here at the base of the hand. And the female is often uncooperative, sometimes extremely aggressive, to the point where she can kill the male and eat him. And it could well be that a male that has a long tail, a longer tail than another male, is more likely to be successful, more likely to not be eaten, because if this sting is not successful, the chances are that he's not going to get to reproduce. He's not going to pass his genes on because the female male will kill him. But as soon as the sting goes in, the female, boom, becomes totally placid. It's really, really quite amazing. She goes from being aggressive, and as soon as the male gets that sting in, she's calmed down, and they can then continue with the whole mating process, which is called the promenade ewe, which is like a dancing kind of a mating ritual. Okay, so that's sexual dimorphism. Once again, the keel situation I think remains the same as far as soil displacement is concerned, soil disruption and displacement. But this sexual dimorphism is, in this case, related to the stinging process. So now we're up to buthids. So buthids are another group of scorpions which show a lot of variation, especially so in the tail. Now in Australia we have Lycus, the scorpions that we still call Lycus, and we have Isometroides, Hemialycus, Australobeuthus and Isometris. So let's have a bit of a look at these. First of all, up here I've got Lycus, this is truncatus from inland South Australia. Top's a female, bottom's a male. There are, I should say, differences between the tails of these two. You can see the segment here, for instance. This fifth tail segment is longer than it is in the female. The vesicle of the male is longer than it is in the female. So there are some differences. The keels are well developed on both species, and also the denticles, which are these little bumps that occur in between. This is the same species, just showing you another shot. You can see here the extent. Now these guys tend to occupy what, from my observations, they seem to occupy disused spider burrows, small spiders, small species of lycosids, wolf spiders and that sort of thing. So they may not have a huge amount of use for kills. So obviously they do to some degree. They would have to make some modifications to burrows when they find them. But they live on hillsides in inland South Australia, in the really hot arid areas. You'll get them on hillsides, and I've seen them going in and out of spider burrows, disused, because there are disused spider burrows everywhere. Just because you find a scorpion inside of a spider burrow doesn't mean that it's a spider killer. There are that many disused burrows that they could easily find a burrow that's not being used as juveniles and occupy it, and they may even move around. These types of scorpions they're not sit and wait predators, they're wanderers. They wander about the place and find food and just sort of set up camp wherever they are. This is Lycus jonesii. Now this is very closely related, I think, to this guy. This one is a more southern species found in the Murray lands of South Australia. Keels, I think, different. They're a bit larger. The spines are larger. So it could be that this animal is relying more on soil removal. It's a bit hard to say. There's not a lot of keels going on here on the fifth tail segment, and that's a common place to see keel reduction, is in the fifth tail segment, which I'll talk about more as we go on. So that's Lycus jonesii, a small species. This is Lycus bucheri. Now, Lycus bucheri is a very, very common species found throughout inland, South Australia and Western Australia, and New South Wales probably as well. I know it's very common in South Australia and Western Australia. As to how far its range extends, I don't know. I don't know if anybody really knows. This is, in my experience, these guys. This one here is from the southern part of its distribution, and the keels are there. They're fairly reduced. They're not hugely prominent. The spines are not great. And this is a species that in inland it mainly occupies sandy areas. And in sandier areas, I think from memory, these keels are even more reduced. I'll have a look at that in a minute, I think. This is Lycus spinatus, subspecies bestie. There are a number of different subspecies which were described years ago. These have all been lumped into, I think, Variatus. I still recognise the old names for them. Once again, this one's fairly keeled. The keel spines are fairly prominent. The keels are reasonably prominent, and these guys are found, amongst leaf litter, and they get underneath things, and they even get up into tree bark and stuff. And So there's still no doubt a fair bit of use in this species for kills. And this particular species has an extremely large Aculeus or stinger, probably prey related. So this is Buceri. I've got these slides really the wrong way. This is Buceri, and this is also Buceri. One of the things you'll notice about Buthers is they have a very, very large tail in comparison to their body. Now, the reason for that will be fairly simple, and that is that these guys are wanderers. Just as with Urodacus, and the male has a larger tail, not the stinging aspect, but just the general fact that the males have a longer tail and a larger stinging vesicle, that carries into the Buthers. But in the Buthers, it's even more amplified, because these guys, like the male Urodacus that have to wander, okay, these guys wander all the time. That's what these guys see. These guys are vagrants. They don't have a permanent burrow situation. They're not sit and wait predators. They are the sorts of scorpions that wander around everywhere and look for their prey. And that means they are always coming into the chance of finding a predator. And to ward off a predator, you've got to have a pretty decent stinging apparatus. It's got to be powerful. It has to deliver a decent punch. So you want to have a pretty decent Aculeus or stinger going on, and you want a powerful tail. You want to be able to bang nail that thing, whatever it is that's trying to kill you. It might be a small marsupial mouse, it could be maybe a spider or something, and you want to be able to bam nail it and cause it pain and run off and survive. So that's what's going on here with this rather large tail. It's one of the typical things about most Buthers. That's another story, which I might do another video of at some stage. Now this is, what species is this? I think, no, there's no spots. This is a Lycus from the South Australian mallee. I can't remember what species it's off the top of my head, that doesn't matter. What I'm looking at here is where this arrow is pointing. This is called the subaculear tubercle. This little thing, this little bump, this little projection, it's not a bump, it's a projection that sticks out here. As it's part of the vesicle. So this is the stinging bulb vesicle, you've got the Aculeus, and you've got the subaculear tubercle. This is a very, very important adaptive morphology in scorpions. This thing here is being lost in Australian scorpions, and I'll explain why. This is a close-up of it. It's called the subaculear tubercle. Now what I'm showing here is, on the right we've got presence of the subaculear tubercle. This is it here. This is Lycus jonesii. And on the left we have Australopithecus, which is the salt lake scorpion. So salt lake scorpions live in very, or they forage, I should say, in very, very open environments. Salt lakes have nothing on them. They're just completely open. I mean, they might have the occasional bit of debris, maybe the slight log here or there, a stick or two. They're very, very open environments. And Australopithecus is basically a derived form of the animal on the right, of this Lycus. And you'll see that the subaculear tubercle has gone. It's been lost. Okay, so the above image shows the loss of the subaculear tubercle in Australopithecus, and it's present in a scrub-dwelling species on the right. Lycus and derivatives of Lycus have gradually reduced, and in some cases lost, the subaculear tubercle as environments have opened up. Let's have a look at that. Lycus armatus. Now this occupies areas with ground vegetation, leaf litter, so scrubby sort of areas. And it has a large subaculear tubercle, quite large and prominent. This is Lycus buceri, the one I mentioned earlier, that lives in sort of sandy environments, mostly in sandy environments. Notice how it's got a very reduced subaculear tubercle. It's almost nothing. It's that small. And these are very, very much open sand dwelling animals. There are some, as I said, found further down south that still occupy some of the leaf litter habitats. But if we look at, this is the adult, if we look at the juvenile, this is a second instar, we see a very prominent subaqueous tubercle. Okay, so this is typical of the way characters are lost. Generally speaking, if it's not needed in the adult stage, it's reduced in the adult stage. You'll still see it present in the younger stage, but it's gradually lost. It's a bit like wisdom teeth. It's a sort of similar kind of a thing. And Australopithecus, once again, close up, just showing that subaqueous tubercle, it actually is there. It's very, very slight bump, but it's virtually non-existent. So it's been lost. So we see a pattern. We see animals that live in scrub have a large subaqueous tubercle. So animals live in areas where there's ground vegetation, lots of ground grasses and trees and leaf litter and so on. They have a large subaqueous tubercle. Scorpions that occupy the more open areas have a reduced subaqueous tubercle. And then when you get into really open areas, like a salt lake, it's gone. Okay, so it's not, for some reason it's lost. It's just not needed anymore. So this is a second instar, Australopithecus, showing the presence of a vestigial subaqueous tubercle, which is rapidly lost in successive molts. In fact, I think it's probably virtually gone in the next molt. But you can just see it here. So as with the Bucheri, where it was present as a juvenile, here, but it's much larger in this species because it's still reasonably present in the adult stage. In this one, it's really small because in the adult it's non-existent, so it's gradually being lost. Now, this subaqueous tubercle here, I don't know if anybody has ever actually come up with a reason for it. I've heard different people have come up with different ideas about what it's for. I never realised what it was for until I saw something happen. I was studying some juvenile scorpions in leaf litter under my microscope, and these scorpions were about 4 or 5 millimeters long. Something they were young Lycus, and I saw one because I was sifting through. I was just checking on them to make sure they're all right and have a look at them. I saw one grab a hold of a leaf. It was a gum leaf, a dried gum leaf. It latched its tail, end tail segment here, like I've shown here, onto the leaf, and it hoiked itself up. And I couldn't believe it when I saw it. I thought, oh man, that's really amazing, because I immediately knew what the subaqueous tubercle was for. If you think about it, it acts as a support for leverage, so the scorpion can flip itself up and escape out of danger, which is what the scorpion was trying to do when I was sifting through. So animals that live in leaf litter, scorpions that live in leaf litter, are going to have like centipedes coming after them, spiders coming after them. They're going to have birds that are sifting through. All different predators are going to be sifting through these kind of habitats. And if you've got a subaqueous tubercle, it means that you have a means of latching on and getting out of the way. It's another means of escape. So if you live on a salt lake, you don't need it. It's the selective pressure for that character has gone, which means it's now neutral. It's not being selected for, it's not being selected against. It has a neutral selective pressure, and when you have a neutral selective pressure, you have a loss of a character. And another feature of some scorpions is this little bump on the subaqueous tubercle. So here's the subaqueous tubercle, but you have this little bump, and I think that that's a pivot point. So you can imagine that it's like a little point, and it enables the tail and the whole animal to swivel more freely because there's less friction because of that one little pivot point. And here's another one. I think you can just see that little pivot point existing there. This is a common animal in the South Australian mallee, lives in amongst leaf litter, gets up into the bark of trees. It gets around the place a lot. And you can see it's got very, very well defined keels, quite prominent. And this is spinatus, like a spinatus group, spined and spined, spinate, spinose. So this is not at all surprising. Looking at the features on this animal, this all adds up and makes sense. So when we get on to Isometroides, and Isometroides are a little bit like Australopithecus in that they're a derived form of Lycus. At least that's how I think of it. They may not be derived. They both have a common ancestor. We could at least say that. Now, what's happened in Isometroides? You might see a slight evidence of a subaqueous tubercle there. There's that slight bump, but there's nothing really left of it. So as with Australopithecus, Isometroides has also lost the subaqueous tubercle. Keels are fairly well developed, still fairly prominent, except for the fifth tail segment, which is just odd. It's punctate, it's pitted, it's full of all those little tiny pits. It's very, very smooth. It's lost all of these ridges. All of the carinae have gone off of here altogether. Now it's thought that these species, these Isometroides, are spider hunters because they're commonly found in wolf spider burrows. So it could well be that what's going on with the tail has to do with overpowering spiders. There are a lot of hairs. So there's a sensory, they're mechanosensory hairs, which means that the scorpion can more readily feel what's going on. And these scorpions have very, very prehensile tails. They're capable of twisting them and bending them and moving them around, a bit like a cat's tail. They're really good at moving them around. Okay, let's get rid of that. So in this case, this is a high specialization. And we see up here close up, you can see that the vesicle is very elongated into the aculeus. That's very long and slender. We've got this punctate or pitted fifth tail segment. We've got an absence of ridges that have gone. Here on the fourth tail segment, we see the ridges are greatly reduced, and then still reasonably prominent here. So it could be that if this is to do with catching spiders, killing spiders, that the selection pressure to kill spiders and to have this change to kill spiders may well be greater than the selection pressure to be able to dig a burrow. And if it's taking over the burrow of a spider, then it doesn't actually need to dig a burrow. So there could be a couple of things that are forcing this directional, this evolutionary change. It could be the prey item being a spider and the fact that it just may not need the carinae as much to dig burrow or change the shape of the burrow. And then we get to these guys. So these guys are very, very odd. This is a group of scorpions which was mainly found in the northern part of Australia, Australia's east coast, forested, generally forested. Some of them are managing to now survive in the more arid areas, but still reasonably close to the coasts. These are Hormeris. They were once called Lykellies. And the first thing you notice about these is their ridiculous little tiny tail, and they have these gigantic, huge pedipalps. Well, I'm not going to talk about the pedipalps in this video because it will just take too long, but I will talk about this. What happens with these animals is that they live in crevices in rocks. So you can imagine a tight crevice like that. And what scorpion does is it backs into this crevice. So you can imagine if you've got a very big tail, it's going to be very difficult to back into a tight crevice because crevices get tighter as you go back. They start wide and they get tighter. And the scorpion can back right into the crevice. If it's got a small tail, it can get further back and it's more likely to survive. It's less likely to be dragged out by a predator and killed. So natural selection favours having a small tail to enable the scorpion to get right back into a crevice. At the same time as having that pressure, that selective pressure, there's also no need for keels because they don't dig burrows. Okay, now some do dig burrows, and they haven't got the quills because they come from an ancestor that didn't have the quills. So if you come back in a million years' time, the ones that are digging burrows may well have evolved quills. So the quills have almost completely gone, not quite completely, but almost completely gone. What's more interesting are these little forward projections, pointing projections. They would assist in biting in. If something's trying to pull a scorpion out and the scorpion uses pressure and pushes its tail down, these little ridges here can act to grip. And these scorpions have a number of features on them that enable them to wedge themselves into a crevice and not be pulled out. Now these are not Buthids, this is a Bothriurid, which is another family again. This is Cercophonius. Cercophonius, not particularly anything much to talk about with them. The tail is fairly standard, except for this huge vesicle and an associated small Achilles. I don't know what's going on. I don't know why these. I can't think of any reason why these guys have evolved this huge vesicle. I just don't know. It's probably prey related, but why I don't know. They're usually associated with trees. They often dig at the burrow. They dig burrows at the base of trees, into rotten logs, down into underneath rotten like old stumps in the ground. If you pull a stump out of the ground, if you're clearing an area and you pull a stump out of the ground, chances are you'll find one of these living down in the base of that stump area. So clearly they need soil removal. They have good strong keels. What's happening with this? I don't know what's happening with the stinger on these. So that's Cercophonius. There's not a lot of variation that I've seen between the different species. This could be the same species. Once again, you can see the keels, quite robust tail, quite strong. Unusual, don't know very much about these scorpions. They're very, very secretive. You don't see them out very often at all. Then another one, an Isometris is a Buthid, not a Bothriurid. This is a Bothriurid. This is a Buthid. Isometris, once again, forested scorpions, high rainfall, east coast of Australia. Very, very large subaqueous tubercle. Heavily forested. It's not surprising the subaqueous tubercle is large on the animal. It's an adaptive feature that aids in the survival and probably in the escape. If my hypothesis is right about them escaping after what I've seen, then this makes a lot of sense. And that's it. So I hope it wasn't too boring and too long. If you liked it, give me a thumbs up. If you thought it was rubbish, give me a thumbs down. I can't see myself here. Scorpions of the World. I'll just show you this book. Scorpions of the World. Great book to have. Has a lot of detail in it, a lot of anatomical detail, morphology, physiology, and it's scorpions of the whole world. Very, very good book to have if you are interested in scorpions. Look it up. There's my book on Australian scorpions, which I wrote for keeping. It has a lot of biology in it. I talk about the sort of things I've talked about in this video. It's only available now as an ebook through Amazon. And this is a great book if you don't have it. It's called Composition of Scientific Words. It's a fantastic book. It's not cheap, but it's a great thick book. It's just because scientific words, you know, if you can break down scientific words, you gain a lot of knowledge about what the words actually mean, and that then relates back to the animal. And a lot of it has to do with comparative morphology. A lot of the nomenclature that's used has to do with comparative morphology. Okay, thanks. See you next time. Okay.